Hello, everyone. Today, we are going to be showcasing the rendering environment in Fusion 360. My name is Steven, and I'm helping out Ryan with these workshops for your bike helmet designs. So hopefully this rendering workshop will be helpful. I'm going to show a little bit of more intermediate and advanced techniques, such as applying emissive light sources, doing some kind of fine-tuning control on different colors and material properties, and also a little bit of texture mapping as well. So quick background on rendering. Rendering, it uses ray tracing to make products look more realistic for marketing purposes, and it's definitely a great way to show off your helmet designs. And rendering can really be broken down into two steps. So let's go to the rendering environment. We have the setting up here, scene settings, which allows us to change our environment and the light sourcing and light settings around our environment that really make our object appear realistic. A good environment is crucial to a good render. And also over here, we have our physical material properties under this appearance tab, which, as you guessed it, allow us to apply specific paints, texture properties, and emissivities, such as this light source right here, to our component. So what we're going to be doing today is show you kind of these steps. And, hopefully it'll kind of be in this particular order that I'm describing now, so you can just jump to that part in the video. So we are going to initialize the colors of this helmet and kind of get what we want in terms of colors and materials, just initializing, not doing any fine tuning. And then we're going to edit the scene settings, so the environment that our object is going to be within. And then we're going to go back to fine tune these basic material properties, such as, the paint on the helmet, really do some fine tuning along with the textures on this chin strap. And we're also going to show off more advanced material properties, such as this transparent case over here in front of the light, and of course the emissive light source behind the casing. And like I said, we'll showcase texture mapping for the strap, more kind of refined texture controls. So that will kind of be thrown in there somewhere. And additionally, this tutorial, the purpose of this is to show you how to just get a good looking render. We're not really going to show off the more artistic principles of rendering, such as doing in context rendering, which, for example, in context rendering is very important because, this bike helmet, if you want to showcase its design, it might be better to show it hanging off a bicycle handlebar, or having it coinciding on top of someone's head, or being in sort of some physical realm, maybe sitting on a desk where a bike helmet would typically be placed, and we could see how it appears in context. So we're not going to be showing any of that today. I just want to show you kind of how to initialize a good looking render. Additionally, kind of more artistic things such as, rule of thirds or other artistic framing principles, we're not really going to be focusing on that either. So the purpose of this workshop, like I said, is just to give you the tools to edit material properties and kind of refine your scene settings so you can, in the future, apply those more artistic learned principles. All right, so we will get started. I have this bike helmet. I opened it up. You can see that everything is all steel. So I'm in the modeling environment, and Ryan was nice enough to make this really cool looking design with the shark fin too. Super cool. And, right off the bat, whenever, you're going to start doing something different, such as a render or a simulation, you always want to save. So we're going to move into the rendering environment and save, and I already saved my object, so that's good. And let's kind of give a quick intro to, a little bit of a more beginner intro on how to operate the rendering environment so it seems a little less intimidating. And rendering is just a simple left to right workflow. So I kind of, mixed up. You can do scene settings and you can do this first, or you can do the appearances first. But really how I like to do it is like I described before. You start off with editing the appearances, and then we change the environment. And then we consider changing the texture maps, which I'll kind of briefly show today. This isn't super crucial a step. And then we can kind of go back to these appearances for more fine-tuned control. And of course, we produce the final render over here. So really quickly, let's go start with explaining appearances and kind of what we want to do with this helmet. So brief introduction, appearances, these are not just colors. So I click on this appearance block over here, and then I really hope you can see this pop-up that's appearing on my screen. I'm assuming you can, and if not, I would have to redo this whole video. So we have this appearance tab right up here. And appearances, like I said, they're not just the way colors look. They have different textures. They have translucence. They have refraction sometimes. They even are emissive, such as this light source that's being used right over here. So most of my materials are steel. I did a little bit of cheating. Ryan helped me out. He kind of already inputted this plastic material over here for the helmet casing, along with this LED light back here. As you can see, as it's shown, we have the acrylic. We actually have a couple of different acrylics. Only one is in this model right now. And I'll kind of get into explaining how this design palette works as well in a second. But yeah, everything by default is steel, as you know, in Fusion 360. It's just whatever your default material properties are. And once we get into the rendering environment, we can change these appearances. So first, let's go summarize what appearances we want to go for. So I'm thinking this helmet would look very cool, kind of a nice metallic red color. So let's go for metallic red for this outer shell around here, up here, down here. And for this inner material, this inner shell, I think some foam would look really nice. So we'll go with kind of a default foam material. We'll do a little bit of color editing for that. Definitely we want an emissive light for this section right here. This light on top of the helmet. It's pretty cool that Ryan was able to add that. And this plastic in front, we'll go with an acrylic setting. So this light can kind of be scattered throughout. The ray tracing will take care of that for us. And also this plastic will make it a little bit frosted too. Kind of nice frosty finish. And I'll show how to do that as well. Also, the chin strap, let's give this a woven nylon appearance. I think we can do a bit more than just dropping a material on here. We can do a little bit of a material that's already in one of these libraries. They actually have some fabrics already. But let's go show how to use a downloaded texture and then apply it to a material or a surface. So yeah, let's get back to explaining this palette. So basically what you do in this design palette is you look for the material that you want in here. So let's start off with paint. So I want to do a metallic red paint on this helmet. So what I would do is go to paint, and we'll go to metallic. There's a lot of different paint colors. I'll kind of explain what differentiates these in a second. But I find metallic red, and I can drag it and drop it onto the body I want to put it on. And bam, we have metallic red on the body itself and inside this palette up here. So any changes, so I right click on this metallic red, I click edit. Any changes I make, usually just click advanced right off the bat because you will still be able to see roughness and reflectance. You'll be able to edit all these properties. The nice thing about clicking advanced is that you can see, you can drag around this pop-up. So that's kind of a nice way to be able to see what you're working on and move the pop-up to the left or right. So yeah, like I was saying, any changes we make to the roughness or the reflection of the highlights or anything on this material will just be done in this instance in this model. So, don't be worried if you're kind of dragging around messing with stuff for these materials when you right click and click edit, because that is just changing it in this model. It's not permanently, changing it within the entire Fusion 360 materials library. It's just in this one model. So feel free to make your changes in your edits, and it's not going to do anything permanently down the line that's going to mess up your other designs that are saved in different models. So this palette, like I said, let's say I change this to a metallic blue. This metallic red, one sec, it didn't work. Let's just click back. Open this up again. if I change this material to a metallic blue, we see that this metallic red is still up here, but it's obviously not being used in our model, in our design. So this palette shows things that were used at one time or are currently being used. So don't get confused if you see a material up here that you're not using. This palette just is kind of like a history, a timeline of what was in this design. So steel is still going to be up here once we remove all the steel and replace it with different colors. Right click on this. I'm going to just delete this, unassign it, and delete it. Doesn't delete it permanently. It's still here, but it removes it from our model. Okay. So that kind of explains that, and I'll briefly mention, so, let's say you want to, there's a couple different ways to drag and drop materials into Fusion, a couple different philosophies to approaching our helmet design. We want this red helmet with the foam, with the emissive light source, with the plastic, with this woven nylon texture down here. So 2 ways to approach this. And spoiler alert, method 2 is the method that I feel like most people are going to want to use. But I'll start off with method 1 to approaching applying different materials. So method 1 is you essentially go down to, you start off with a base material. So let's say I want to do kind of a metallic paint for this helmet, but I want to define it with my own specific settings. I don't want to start off with any defaults. So I will go to Other, Base Materials, and then you would find probably this layered material over here. And you can drag and drop it onto the model and see that it's just this basic kind of opaque, shiny layered material. And that is going to give us very similar properties to what we have for metallic materials, base highlights, some more advanced controls that I will get into later, and kind of give us a lot of flexibility. But you're going to have to determine the color yourself. If you have an idea of the RGB values in mind, this might be a good approach. You drop on one of these opaque base materials and then you edit the RGB values. But if you want a little bit more assistance with picking your materials, I would kind of recommend looking for ones that are already made for us in the Fusion 360 library. So I kind of know I want a nice red metallic color here. So I can just go to Paint and go to Metallic. And then just what I did here, drag and drop this red right onto my model. And it's kind of nice. It's a good start. Some things are already filled in for me. This roughness, the weight, I think that might have been the same for the opaque materials as well. It's kind of nice just to have some in-context colors, some colors already applied for us. And then, of course, I can change these right up here. I'll show how to do that in more detail later. So that's method 2. Method 2 is using something that's already made for us and not starting off with these kind of default base materials within this other tab and the base materials within that. So method 2 is kind of going to be good for most people. Finding something close to what we want. We wanted a red metallic paint, and it looks like they have exactly that here. So we will fine tune that later. Also, I kind of right now want to explain what's the difference between, what's the difference between this metallic paint and you might have seen this other glossy paint down here, right? Are they all the same and they just have different settings in terms of roughness and reflection, or is there more? And the answer is that there is a little bit more going on. So let's go drop in this enamel paint over here. So definitely metallic paint, I think will look better for this helmet. So we'll finish off, ending with that design choice. But let's go show off this enamel paint up here. And it looks almost the same. Really quickly, let's do an in-canvas render to see what it would look like, in real time. What it would look like once we actually finish a render. In-canvas render, we're going to be using this tool a lot today, but it really showcases, what the rendering environment, what the object is actually going to look like in the final render before you actually commit to the final render. So the glossy paint really doesn't look that much different than this metallic paint. You might notice that metallic paint has a few more highlights, a little bit more depth to it compared to this, enamel glossy paint. But let me explain the differences here. So the enamel paint, I right click on this and I click edit, open up advanced, and we just have, let me turn off in-canvas render so my computer doesn't blow up. We have reflectance, we have roughness, we can make our object translucent, which we don't really, I'll explain this in more detail later what all these do. Emissivity, we can add a texture map, and a little bit of stuff with advanced highlight controls, which I'll get into later once we, fully refine the paint job that we want. So you kind of see this right here, not too many options, not too overwhelming. But when we right click on the metallic paint and click edit, click advanced, we have base highlights. We have a bump map, a texture map for those base highlights, roughness and weight that's assigned to those highlights. Kind of see how, before we do an in-canvas render, how we can change the roughness of the top base highlights. I should say base highlights, not top coat. That's different because in metallic paints, we do have a top coat. Compared to the glossy paint, it's all kind of one continuous sheen of paint, one layer. But here we have a top coat that we can edit the reflectance. We can add a little bit of roughness to matte it out, like kind of a matte flat paint color, and a texture map for that top coat as well. So you can see that we have more options for the metallic paint than the glossy paint. So just to know, if you want to get kind of a metallic, really shiny, pretty multi-layered glimmer for your helmet, and you're starting off with the glossy paint, the enamel glossy paint, that might not be the best approach. You might want to start off with a metallic paint because you have more options. And that kind of goes for a few of these different settings under paint. Metal flake, let's just drag and drop that in here. We see that we have a lot more properties. One sec, it looks like it's not working. Let me close this and open this up again. Sometimes the palette doesn't open when you want it to. Let's just drag and drop this on here. And then right click on this, click edit. And we have rotation of the metal flakes. We still have the same, base highlights and top coat properties. We have a bump pattern with these metal flakes in it. We'll get into texture mapping later. But yeah, things get a little bit more complex with these defaults. And that's the great thing about these defaults. We have powder coat paints as well that have different texture maps to them as well, kind of a more rough appearance for typical powder coat styling. So, thanks for hanging on with me here, but it is important to understand these nuances. Like I said, you want to, if you're going to be starting off with the defaults in Fusion or going with, some base materials, you might want to do a more layered base material if you want a very, multi-layered bike helmet, because you'll get more properties than with the opaque base material. All right, so let's go back. And I think what we're going to be doing today is I want to show off the glossy paint because it's a little bit simpler than the metallic paint and it's easier to see differences. So I'm going to drag and drop those properties on there in a sec. We're going to eventually end off with this metallic red paint, but for showing off how to, fine tune those sliders, we're going to do it on the glossy paint because it is indeed a lot easier to, see, what happens if we up reflectance, what happens if we change our roughness on this glossy paint in comparison to this metallic paint, where changes are a lot more minute and fine-tuned. Okay, so really quickly, we saw that I dragged and dropped these materials onto here. How can I confirm that without just, outside of visual inspection? So I can click on bodies over here, and I can, let's say this material here, I can click on it and find the associated body. Having trouble finding here. Let's go click on this one maybe. Not showing up. Usually you can click on the material and you'll see that the body lights up. Let's go with this front light case actually. We'll click on that and we see that this body lights up over here. Right click on that. And we click on click on properties over here. And then we can see that the physical material is steel, but the appearance is acrylic. So that nice clear acrylic color. And what are the differences between physical materials and appearances? Well, to put it quickly, physical materials are for FEA. So there are a lot less physical materials than appearances, because physical materials, they have Young's moduluses attached to them, their material properties, Young's modulus, tensile strength, etc. So, we don't have a wood physical material because it's non-homogeneous. So it would be really hard to do FEA with it. But we have, wood appearances, acrylic appearances, fabric appearances, liquid appearances, so much more. So, whenever you're editing these materials in the rendering environment, make sure to edit the appearance and not the physical material. And the appearance is what you click on right up here. So make sure you're kind of always clicking on this color swatch up here, this palette, and then you will edit the appearance. Because if we do some FEA on some finite element analysis on this shielding, on this light case up here, it will actually act as if it were steel. But all we need is appearances for rendering. So that's kind of the differences between those two. All right, so let's go drag and drop. Finally, what we've been waiting for, let's go drag and drop these materials just so we can get an idea of what we want. So like I said, I'm going to be doing glossy paint. It's kind of glossy enamel paint for this outer shell. So let's go drag and drop that there. Drag and drop this here. Looks good. We have the LED taken care of over here, and we have the acrylic taken care of here. It's something really interesting to note is that, let's go hide this front light case. This LED was actually applied on a face. You don't have to drag and drop these materials, these textures on the entire bodies. You can just do what Ryan did here. He cut out this section over here, did probably a split face command, or separated this face in some way, indicated it with a sketch. And then he was able to click on faces and drag and drop this LED just onto this face over here. And that's kind of what I recommend for LED bulbs, because for LED textures, we don't want a giant emissive mass emanating from all sides in many cases for rendering. So sometimes it's nice to just click on this face option up here and drag and drop this LED texture just onto that face. Okay, so that's what we did there. So that looks good. Acrylic looks good, checks out. What about the foam? Let's go find a nice foam material for this inner shell. This foam is under miscellaneous. I thought it was under other for some reason. It's under miscellaneous. And you open up miscellaneous. We have all these really cool materials over here that you can mess with. Those are pretty cool. Carbon fiber and all sorts of cool stuff. Emissive, we're going to get into that later. So we're going to open up foam. And for a bike helmet, they use polyurethane, typically. So we're going to drag and drop that material right onto this inner shell. Make sure that we can select that. Let me actually see if I can select this entire body right here. That looks good, foam 1. So we can actually, if we want to have more fine-tuned selection, drag and drop this material onto just foam 1, the entire body. And we can see how that material has changed. So that looks pretty good. Right off the bat, I kind of want to darken this a little bit, just because I think black with a darker gray would look better for our foam material. So let's do our first kind of, example of color editing. And let's right click on this foam, click edit. And we're going to go to advanced properties, open that up. And for foam, we see that things are a bit different. We actually have a texture map. So we have a bump map down here, which is kind of giving off this, not really facade, but this, this demonstration of light bouncing off a complicated texture pattern, when in reality, the texture just gives off, a kind of fake depth, if that makes sense. The texture, this material is still flat on all sides, but the texture is giving off an example of depth. So we'll get into that more later. But what we want to do, I kind of want to darken this. So we see that they dragged and dropped this image that coincides with this roughness texture and with this bump pattern texture. But we would prefer something a bit darker than this image. And what I would recommend doing is typically really good practice to have, if you have a texture map, it's good to have an image that sits on top of it and matches the bumps and roughness pattern on the texture, as these ones were designed to do. They were designed to fit together and kind of coincide. But we are just going to replace this image with an entirely black color. And I'm going to kind of go with, let's do kind of a more grayish color. Let's kind of move up here. I think this would look good. It's dark gray. Click OK. And it's kind of a shame because we got rid of, it's good to, like I said, good to pair images with textures. But once we kind of do an in-canvas render, you'll see that some of the texture is still there for that nice foam material properties. But if I had an image that kind of had those, little foam embellishments and foam, foam appearance, it would probably make this texture look even more convincing. So in most cases, I probably, drag out that image they had for the foam. I kind of do some editing on it and maybe darken it or remove some contrast so we could indeed have, a foam image to place over the top of this texture over here so it can match with the roughness and relief pattern texture maps. So that looks good. All right, I like that. That looks great with the in-canvas render. And finally, we want to do this chin strap over here. Now we're going to be importing our own textures and be putting on our own bump maps on this chin strap later. So for now, let's just go to Other, Base Materials, and just drop a default opaque base material on this chin strap. And then, oh shoot, I still have faces selected. My bad, I should change that back to body/components and drop this on that entire chin strap, remove the appearances applied to faces. And we have a nice opaque texture applied here now that we will edit later with bump mapping. All right, so that looks great. Now let's get into, now that we've done kind of our default colors and settings, let's get into how to edit the scene settings in the environment that is going to be showcasing our component, our bike helmet. So let's close this and move from appearances to scene settings. So scene settings, these include lighting, background, ground reflections, and camera orientation. And like I said, let's move over. We go from left to right up here. So we go here, and then we go to scene settings. And the most important thing, in my opinion, for scene settings is to define the aspect ratio. So the aspect ratio is going to define kind of the framing, the border that we're going to use for our final render. And on top of that, it allows us to kind of determine what spacing we're going to be having for this helmet, how it's going to fit inside these borders. And this is really important because we don't want any of the helmet jutting outside of our borders. So when we render it, everything's all screwed up, right? We have the helmet, it's just not fitting on the page. So we want to kind of define typically a 16:9 aspect ratio is what is used in industry. You'll see when we click that, these borders appear on the sides. So now we can kind of drag our helmet around and center that with respect to these borders. And when we're doing this rendering from now on, we actually have an idea of how our final render is going to look like, because we're going to produce a final render in 16:9. So therefore, we know it's going to comfortably fit within these borders and look kind of just like this. So that looks good. 16:9, we're going to do 1080p, so that fits with the 16:9 aspect ratio. That's awesome. So the second thing we want to do after this aspect ratio is, I know we kind of want to jump to these things, but this is equally important. We want to define a home view that we like. So some view that we can snap to, if we ever lose track or we start orbiting in a direction, we want to kind of get back to this really good angle that we had. We want to define a view that will allow us to, we'll be able to get back to. So I think this angle looks really good, to be honest. Maybe zoom in just a little bit, probably maybe zoom out. Actually, I think this looks perfect for a render. So I'm going to open up named views, right click on this and click new named view. And this view is now saved, this angle. And we are going to call this a very creative view 1 and click enter. Looks good. And we see that if I click on the top view or I kind of drag around this view cube over here and I get lost, I click on the home icon, I still don't like what I'm looking at. I can always click on view 1 to return me to that nice angle that I had initialized. Okay, so that's good. We did aspect ratio and we saved a default view. So be sure to save up here, continuously save, Control S, Command S. And let's go back to our scene settings. So great, we did view, we did that. Now let's kind of get into these guys up here. And typically what I like to do before I edit the brightness is determine what background I want to use. And there are a variety of different backgrounds that we have at our disposal. So we have these solid color backgrounds, such as kind of, we have gray, or we can change the colors to do maybe something a bit more pinkish, or anything that will really allow our design to stand out. So I like this default gray, but we can kind of, change what background we want and then click apply, and that will change the background, respectively, how our model is going to look, because background is a crucial indicator tool for reflections and how our design is going to appear in context. So we're going to stick with the default gray. We also have these environments. So we have custom environments in the Fusion 360 environment library, such as kind of sharp headlights. We have cool lights that we can work with, grid lighting. And for these environments, they're kind of cool because you can actually see that we're inside a physical, three-dimensional, 360 degrees environment. But for the sake of this model, I'm not going to be using any of these environments. You can also attach custom environments. So you can go online and download custom HDRI files to get kind of these panoramic file types that have different light settings and make your model look really cool in context if you have an environment in mind. But we're not going to be doing that. But typically for using an environment, just some recommendations. I think that soft light, warm light, and cool light are usually kind of the best environments to stick with. They're going to make your design look really cool if you want to do a bit more than the gray background. So let's go back over here. We're going to return to that kind of, you might think it's bland, this gray background, but I think it's going to really amount to some cool looking reflections. It's really going to show off our helmet design. So this looks cool. This looks good. And now we're going to start our in-canvas render. And we're going to see how our model is actually going to look once this render finalizes. So in my opinion, I think that with this gray background, our object looks a little bit dark. So now we can start to kind of edit the brightness up here. And with these darker colors, I think it's usually good to, up it maybe 500 to 1,000 tick marks. I think that looks good. So let's go try 1,500 and see how our design looks. And I think that looks a lot better. It's more bright. And we can edit this LED later to, not explode this front panel too much. So we can do a little bit more work there. But I think that this bright environment is going to be good to kind of show off more detail in our design. You want it to be bright, but not too bright in terms of exploding details. We want details to be present, but nothing to be exploded or overexposed. So I think this 1,500 is going to be a good point to start with. So that looks good. Also, something else you can do, and that I recommend turning off. This is also a crucial kind of tool for really, defining your reflections on your model. And I would turn off in canvas render for this. We can edit the position of where the light source is coming from. So 0 degrees looks pretty good, but you see that we can kind of rotate how the light is appearing. And sometimes you'll have a helper shadow that's visible over here, but it's not visible right now because we have not flattened the ground. If we do that, you can kind of sometimes see a helper shadow that appears, but not in this case. So you see that we rotated the environment a little bit, and the reflections look a lot different. So I definitely don't want a reflection that's kind of going down the shark fin up here. So I'm going to return to kind of that default 0 degrees rotation that we started with. And I think this looks pretty good for our design. Maybe rotate it just a wee bit more this way. I think this would look nice. So yeah, that looks pretty good. You know what? Screw it. Let's go back to 0. That looks. Let's stick with the angle that we had originally. And I think this looks pretty good for our design. So you can edit the position as well up there. So you can probably hear my computer getting really hot. This in-canvas rendering does a lot of work. But now we can kind of move into the fun settings after we determine the brightness and the position of our environment. So like I mentioned before, we have these ground plane settings over here, which we can flatten our object to the ground and also add some reflections off the ground. And you can't really see them now, but if we tune down the roughness, and in some cases, look up top, you can see our shadow, and if you look really closely, you can also see some reflections that are coming off the ground. It kind of disappears once you do the in-canvas render, but it's very subtle. And I recommend using the reflection tool and flatten ground options if you want your object to be close to the ground and having a cool reflection sitting underneath it. For the sake of our helmet, we definitely want it floating in the air. So we are going to turn off these features. We do not need those. Also even get rid of the ground plane. Let's go back to view 1, and that looks good. So now let's get into our camera orientations. And this is, the whole purpose for doing rendering is to give off this effect of as if we were either looking at this object straight on with kind of a naked eye, or perceiving it as if it was taken, as it was shot with the camera. So first and foremost, in photography, everything has a perspective point of view. We do not want to change to orthographic. That's the whole point of the rendering environment, is to show things with the perspective orientation. Orthographic is really good for, doing our design. We have, parallel edges will be straight. They'll line up with each other. But we definitely don't want that for our render. So always keep this on perspective for a rendering. Focal length is another thing that you can edit. And this is another feature that gives depth to our perspective view. Let's go turn off in-canvas render. And we see that when we mess with the focal length, see how wonky that can get? So we don't want to max it out because this is kind of the equivalent of just taking an infinity shot where there's no object that you're really essentially focusing on, and it eliminates a lot of that depth that we want to attain with this perspective view. So we're going to kind of return this to what we had before. I think this 90 range, anything within the default settings around 90 millimeters to 100 will give you a pretty good looking focal length that will be realistic enough and not take away depth or not give too much depth, and kind of a nice compromise between them, something realistically what we'd be looking at. So we also have exposure down here, and this is an indicator of how much light is entering the camera. And I really recommend playing around with this one. It's a little bit different than brightness because you really got to know what you're going for in terms of exposure. So brightness, this changes the environment, the entire environment uniformly, and the environment and object are going to brighten at the same rate. It's not super obvious here, but that's kind of what's happening. Whereas exposure is it's a more refined setting, and it determines how the camera perceives the light. And when the slider is edited, we can see how things can really quickly blow up. So I do not like that. So I can just click Control Z, click back, and return to what we had before. That was actually a terrible idea what I did right there. So sometimes if you click back and you don't save, it will start just removing stuff. It'll remove a lot more than you thought you were removing. So I never really, it's tricky. Sometimes it won't let you go back if you do some small slider adjustments like the exposure or the brightness. Instead, to do that, you actually have to go back to these settings and click on Restore Defaults. And this is kind of annoying because we have to reset our aspect ratio, but reset our brightness. But if you start, clicking back a few times and you see that nothing is changing, you might actually be going back further in the timeline than you thought. So often you have to click Restore Defaults to, reinitialize what we had before. So definitely didn't like that exposure. I'm returning it to 9.5, what we had before, and that looks good to me. So the final feature within this scene settings environment, within the scene settings tool, is to adjust the depth of field. And you're probably not going to be doing this for your helmet design because you probably want a nice shot such as this one that showcases the entirety of the helmet. But I think depth of field is a really cool tool for pinpointing specific locations along the helmet that you want to highlight. So we open up depth of field and we can select the center of focus. Let's go turn on an in-canvas render and do a little bit of a zoom up here. And you'll see that as we set the center of focus up here, we're going to create this very shallow depth of field, which can of course be edited by dragging this blur slider up and down, that focuses on just this one region that we selected along this face. So see that this face right here is in more focus. This entire plane is in more focus than the background and the foreground. And this is a really great feature, like I said, for trying to either do artistic shots or really showing off specific elements along the helmet or whatever design you're working with. So probably won't be focusing on this, won't be using this much for our design, but it's a really great tool to make a good render look phenomenal, honestly. Make a good render look great, something that a photographer would take. So wonderful, this render looks good. I think our lighting looks good. Our view looks great. We didn't really mess too much with focal length or exposure. I think that looks fine. So we will close this and we are officially done with editing our scene settings. Let's go save that. And we're looking good. So let's go fine tune our appearance right now. We already set up these material properties earlier, but I think that we can really refine them. So let's turn on the in-canvas render. Let's turn that back on and open up this appearances tab up here. So like I said, when we change appearances, they're not permanent. They are only going to change them within this model. And as I showed as well, we have different editable features for each paint. So we're going to be showing off how to change appearances for the glossy paint because like I mentioned earlier, it's a bit easier to see how increasing roughness or changing reflectance affects these kind of glossy, these very simple textures, these simple materials. And then later we'll drag and drop this metallic paint to finalize our design. But for now, we're going to keep it with this enamel glossy paint. I'll show you how we can edit that. So let's click on enamel. Let's click on that. So this paint's in our model. So we're going to edit it. Click on advanced properties. And let's kind of show off how to edit some of these features. So first and foremost, we can edit the RGB value. So you can click on here and you can actually type in, what RGB values you want to attain what what types of colors you had in mind. So I think that this red looks pretty good. We can darken it or change the colors however we find appropriate, but I think that this red looks good, but you can do more fine settings up here. So what about reflectance and roughness? So reflectance, this determines the shine and polish of the material. So less roughness, these kind of work hand in hand. Less roughness allows no reflections to shine off the object, while max reflectance essentially turns our object into a giant red mirror. So roughness, in context with reflectance, this really controls the finish of our object. So our object can still be reflective, but we can give it more of a matte appearance, a matte surface finish. And in principle, the more roughness, the less reflectance we will see. And therefore, for a more painted finish, you want to minimize roughness. So there's a fine balance between roughness and reflectance. And a couple more notes. The object will always stay shiny if it's not reflective at all. So let's go tune that down, turn down reflectance and roughness. You can see that it's still shiny. So you really need roughness to kind of, keep tabs on reflectance. You need roughness to remove some of this reflectance, if that makes sense, especially at steeper viewing angles when you're always going to have a lot of shine. So long story short, these two guys are going to be the bulk of what you're editing, I feel like, for your material properties when you're looking at your helmet. And in summary, it's a balancing act. So you're going to have some reflectance, and you're going to take away some of that by adding roughness, which gives it more of a texture. So just to show off these later features down here, I'm going to give this helmet more of a matte appearance, and we're going to do that by keeping our reflectance at 0.04, but increasing the roughness all the way to 0.6. On that, 6. And you can immediately see how not only this ball is changing up here to indicate how we changed our design, but our model itself is now very matte. And now that we've changed that, I definitely don't want to stick with this for our final design, but I can kind of more easily show off what these features do down here. So translucency, first of all, is barely noticeable for paints. Open that up, can turn it on. And what it does is it's really beautiful for plastics. And it kind of shows an internal layer inside something, kind of some internal light scattering, if that makes sense. And like I said, it's not super noticeable for paints. It looks like we did apply some translucence. So we can give it a little bit more of a see-through texture. But I don't really want this for a paint. It's not the best idea. It's better for kind of plastics or more water or materials that we're going to have some internal light scattering going on. So if we want it, a plastic with an internal light scattering, kind of like nice deep purple color inside that plastic, we could change the RGB values over here for the translucence to be, let's say, kind of a purple color. And you can see with the in-canvas rendering that it's going to, you can see some purple flecks appear, but once the render finishes, there's not much purple that's apparent and obvious right off the bat. So for our paint, we're going to turn off translucency. Now emissivity, definitely one of my favorites, and this turns the material into a light emitting body. And we will get into this later to show off how we can edit this light feature over here. And also, a very largely important aspect of applying a texture is adding a relief pattern or a bump map, which is driven by an image. And there are a variety of different images and bump maps that we can use. We have height maps, we have normal maps, and I'll kind of show that off later when we're kind of working on the strap over here. But for now, we don't really need a bump map. For the powder coat paints, there indeed is a bump map. So kind of that will apply a powder coat rougher texture that will kind of give this material a texturized property to it. So that's where we can input bump maps. The cutout feature is it allows us to make parts of the texture transparent via a black and white image, where black will be invisible and white will be the material. So this is really good for doing flame effects or kind of smoke effects or something of that nature, some kind of otherworldly effect of objects floating in the air that are texturized to your liking. And this is also really good for kind of doing decals with particular textures. So if you don't like the sheen or kind of the glossiness of the default decals that we'll kind of showcase later, we're applying decals to our helmet, you can use cutouts to, cut out specifically just that decal, and then of course apply whatever roughness and reflectance we want to that texture to make our logo appear as you would like. So let's get into advanced highlight controls. The reason I did this matte texture is because it's a lot easier to see what's going on with these guys down here with a flatter finish. So these features are definitely more refined, but they can give you some really cool effects, especially if you're working with brushed materials. So anisotropy, let's go turn this up really high. And you'll see kind of these new gleams of light that appeared. So it's on now. When I turn it off, you'll see that a lot of this light is kind of more dissipated across like the entirety of our design. Whereas when I turn this up, we kind of get these channels of light that are more focused in specific regions, like over here, back here. So anisotropy, it really shapes and refines the direction that light shines off the material. And like I said, this can simulate highlights for brush materials, and it's pretty important for fine texture control. So feel free to edit this with your helmet as you would like, and we can use orientation to change the direction that these channels of light are passing across our helmet. So I can kind of up this, let's change it to 90 degrees. We'll see that is kind of more pointing downward now instead of across the helmet like it was before. So we can kind of change the color of these highlights. And finally, so we can do that here by editing color or adding an image. And we can also change the shape of them. So long story short, fall off will give you smoother highlights for a long fall off. But a short fall off will make these highlights appear sharper. So we'll go back to short. You see that it might appear a bit more sharp versus the long fall off. So that's really all the features that you have for kind of this enamel glossy paint. But this is kind of in general what you're going to be looking at when you're editing material properties for any texture. You should have all these options at your disposal. And when we're going to be working with our metallic paints, which I will drag and drop onto the model right now, you have more refined texture control. So we're still going to have these options such as these advanced controls like anisotropy for the top coat and for the base highlights. But of course, we can also edit the roughness and weight of all these materials as well. So that looks good. I think this metallic paint looks pretty good by default. The reflectance looks nice. I think the default roughness also looks good. So we're going to stick with that. So how about we take a look at editing the plastic? So we'll figure out how to edit this front light case to get the exact appearance that we're going for. And I think kind of as we have here, this frosted finish will look really good for our plastic casing. So let's get started and kind of show you how to get that effect for this acrylic plastic if you are indeed trying to make a casing for a light. It looks like we're working on this acrylic over here. I don't think this one's in the model, so I can delete that. Perfect. Okay. Now we can edit this over here, the plastic that's in our model. I'll kind of explain what all these different parameters do. So for glass, liquids, and plastics, the process is pretty simple. We have absorption distance, index of refraction, and roughness, these three main parameters. And absorption distance is how far the light travels through the material, and decreasing this makes the material more opaque. And this is really good for liquid usage, such as differentiating between tea or a coffee. Now, refractive index, index of refraction, defines how much light is bent when traveling through the object. And we have presets for all these materials here. I think the default for this acrylic plastic is actually 1.49, so it's pretty much equivalent to glass, which is 1.5. So we can just keep it at glass. And this doesn't really matter too much as long as you're editing roughness. So index of refraction will kind of make the material appear a bit sharper. But when we're adding a frosted effect to either plastic or glass, whatever material we're working with, that is really going to take charge in terms of appearance. So I think that this frost effect is actually pretty good. I'll show you kind of what it looks like when we turn it down. You'll see that the glass will get clearer, and it will have less of that frosted finish. And if we increase it a lot, we can see that this light is really bouncing around inside this glass, or inside this plastic. So we increase that roughness and you're getting kind of a mega frost effect. So I keep using the word frost, but I think that's the right term that we use for determining how to make this glass appear more translucent instead of transparent. So let's go change that to 0.12. I think that looks pretty good. And of course, inside this plastic, or inside the material editor, we have all sorts of other things that are kind of going on. We have relief patterns, bump maps. We can add textures, we can add cutouts. We also have the same advanced highlight controls that we saw before. We're not really going to mess with any of that today. You can also, of course, change the color of the plastic. So click right up here to change the RGB value to whatever color you want. I think white looks good, so looks good to me. You can also click over here and have all these different Pantone colors, so kind of these default colors. But I would just recommend clicking up here for more refined color selection. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to organize my notes a little bit, make sure I'm not skipping over anything. And of course, if you want to add kind of like a patterned glass, you could, how do you do that here? You could actually go add a bump map. You could add a texture. So this would, like I said, this would be really good if you want to give that glass kind of a patterned look, like a stained glass finish, or a nice patterned look on top. So this looks good for now. We're going to click OK. I like that. The in-canvas render looks beautiful. So I already actually stuck with these exact same materials here, these exact same properties. So I just click cancel, but if you want to save, you click OK. We're going to stop the in-canvas render, and this looks good. So what we want to do next is mess with the emissivity of this light back here. So that is controlled by this LED up here. And not every material has emissive features. So to get to the LEDs in the first place, we go to, let me close all these tabs. So we go to miscellaneous, we go to emissive, and then we can pick one of these bulbs here. So we have frosted bulbs, we kind of have these LED, these very bright white LED textures, and of course we can change those colors. We have blue LEDs, green and red. And I would probably pick the least emissive LED, which is this one up here. It gets more emissive as you go down. Those are the main things that are different between them. And let's go edit this LED a little bit because I think it's kind of bright. So edit, we'll open up advanced properties, and pretty basic, honestly, nothing too surprising. So we have the color of the LED itself. So you know what? I think we can make this, let's make this slightly more yellow. Click up here. And I kind of like this yellow right here. Can I darken it? Now let's keep it really bright. Click OK. And that is going to be the general color. So that actually doesn't change too much in terms of the LED itself, because if it's very emissive, it's just going to be a lot of white light. So actually, I think we want to change the filter color under this emissivity tab right here. And to make this LED yellow, I think we click down here, open up color, and let's click on this yellow, the same shade up here. Click OK. And there we go. Now we're getting that kind of yellow hue that we were looking for. So luminance is going to determine the magnitude of the brightness of this LED. So let's just have some fun, crank it all the way up. And if we didn't have this plastic casing in front, you will see that it is very, 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 very bright. So this front light case is actually doing a lot of work for the ray tracing to let the light bounce around along the inside of the material. So let's go tune that down, something a little lower. I forgot what it was before. So I'm actually going to hit cancel, go back to edit this, go to advanced properties. And so it was like 130,000. So I'm going to change to that color I liked before over here. Click OK. And we're just going to tone that down just a little bit to about half of that. So we're going to do, let's just do 75,000. Click apply. And that is a bit less extreme, the brightness. So that looks good right there. Now, what about these properties up here, reflectance and roughness? Well, they're not going to really be doing too much in terms of the LED itself. I would really mess around with these if you wanted to. I bet it's the same properties as what we had before in terms of, making the surface slightly more reflective and slightly more rough. I think these are more surface parameters up here. What you really want to be doing for these lights, focusing on these emissivity features up here. Let's go tune this all the way down and see what happens. Yeah, it's kind of really hard to distinguish what's going on because for an LED, like I said, the emissivity is the important part, and that kind of overrides the luminance. It overrides these parameters up here. So that looks good. I like that. Yellow bulb. We're going to click OK. And that will do it for the LED. I think that looks really nice behind this plastic cover. So what else needs to be done? So we've done this outer shell, this inner foam shell. Looks really good. I think the inner foam shell, we don't really have to do much editing with it. We could obviously do more fine tuning in terms of the coloration. I think that this looks really good in terms of the in-canvas render, along with the LED as well. So that leaves us with this strap. And if you remember earlier, we kind of put a default opaque material on top of this. So what we want to do now is import or utilize that custom texture map that I downloaded earlier. And we will see if we can give this strap a little bit more pizzazz, for lack of a better term, to really see if we can give it some texture. See if we can kind of give it a woven nylon appearance, because a lot of these flat textures, disregarding this foam, that looks great, can get kind of boring after a while. So let's go turn off the in-canvas render right now and get into how to set up texture mapping. So we will edit this base opaque material. Edit, looks good. We will go into advanced properties. And let's kind of discuss what we need in terms of these textures. So it looks like during the video, it didn't really show my file explorer while I was talking. So I'll kind of re-explain what these texture map features do and kind of what they are all about. So usually when you download texture maps from the internet, you're not just downloading an image, and you're not just downloading specific height maps, normal maps, or roughness maps. You're kind of you're getting all of these put together in a package, sometimes with even additional maps that can help that texture come to life. And in summary, textures are flat, but these roughness maps, normal maps, and colors often will give off the illusion that the texture itself has height and kind of gives a 3D effect. So really quickly, just to summarize what these do, we're going to use them in a second. So the color map, which we have over here, is just a picture of the material. And we're actually not going to use this, but usually it's a picture that sits directly on top of the texture and kind of completes the look. It coincides with these other maps over here. We also have a roughness texture, which matches this JPEG image. And instead of a uniform roughness, which we get by adjusting that roughness slider, we'll kind of get a roughness that is dependent on the coloration of this image and kind of matches this pattern. And finally, we also have normal maps and height maps. And they're a little bit different, but these are both essentially, you have one choice or the other when using a bump map to give off our 3D effects. So you can't use both of these, you only use one or the other. So a normal map has a color gradient, as you can see here, kind of a purple and bluish, and this determines how light is reflected off the material at specific angles. So this kind of shows the angles at which light is reflecting off the object. Whereas a height map, the other option, this only contains height information. So ups and downs and highs and lows and depth areas as well. So that is kind of determined by the intensity of the color, or more black or more white is going to determine if it's a high or low region. So we're going to be using a normal map for our bump map texturing, but you can also use a height map. You can use either one. So feel free to try out both if you download a texture map that has both. And on top of that, both of these are used, in CGI or video games to kind of give off a texture effect. So it's kind of cool what we're doing. We are applying, real texture map images to do what they do in industry. So that's kind of the summary of how texture maps work and the files that you can use to make them appear realistic. So let's go back to our settings over here. And I think that this chin strap, I would like to give it a nice black color. So we'll go to color over here and just darken this on the slider. It gets slightly gray, looks good. Let's turn on the in-canvas render. And now let's apply the roughness map really quickly. I know we all want to get to the bump map, but we'll do the roughness map first. So click on image, and we need to find that document that we were working on. See, I have a lot of folders, and we will apply the roughness map. And if you look really closely, you'll see that the texture is slightly coming to life. It's not apparently obvious now, but there is a slight pattern that matches the bump map that we are going to overlay. Okay, let's go back to kind of that default view we had set up. And we will do the bump map. So we don't want any translucency, we don't want any emissivity. We are going to check off relief pattern bump map. And then it will take us right to the place where the bump maps are. And we are going to use the normal map. So one more thing, normal map is more like angles, how light is reflected off the object, whereas height map is more, what's high, what's low. And we're going to be using the normal map today. So double click on that, and that's the image we're going to select. But before you even take a gander at the texture, we are not done yet. we're going to click over here to the right. So this step is really important, especially if you're using a normal map. And I'll show you why. So click on this drop down, click Edit Image, and we have to do this very important checkbox called Link Texture Transform. So make sure to check this off. And what this does is it makes sure that the normal map, the roughness map, and also just if you're using an image for the color, that those are all linked together. So if I change the scaling in any way, the positioning, the rotation of this texture map, the roughness map will also change. And the general image will also adjust itself accordingly. Finally, so we can do some scaling if we wanted to. We could blow up this map, we could shrink it depending on how much detail we want. But if you can check right down here at the bottom, it thinks that we're using a height map. So this texture does not look as good as it could be looking right now because it thinks we're using a height map, but we are instead using a normal map. So click over here and change that to normal map. And let's see how our texture pans out. We can get that nice nylon woven pattern. You can already see the difference in our results. A really beautiful looking woven pattern on our chin strap. So that's really important. This bottom step right here, make sure that if you're using a height map, that height map is selected. And if you're using a normal map is selected. Okay, so that looks good. That is kind of the basics of texture mapping. I'll show off a little bit more up here. We can do some more refined texture map controls, but you'll see right off the bat once we do that, that Fusion knows what's best in terms of automatically mapping this for us. So we really don't have to do too much work ourselves. Click Done, looks good. So we did the bump pattern, the relief pattern, the bump map. Don't really want to do any advanced highlight controls. And if your texture is ever too dark, the color's too dark and you can't see the texture, you can always mess around with the reflectance to kind of make that texture be shinier and have a little bit more pop to it. So yeah, that looks great. Have that woven material. And like I said before, we will get right into the texture map transform. So let's click close up here. I'm going to turn off in-canvas render for a quick second. And sorry, I said texture map transforms, texture map controls. So we want to edit this texture map right here. And the projection type is automatic. So this is Fusion 360 automatically determining how this texture is going to manifest itself along these straight lines, along this curved area down here. And you will see how good of a job Fusion did with this once we start making it not automatic. So we have planar texture mapping, which allows you to wrap the texture about some plane that looks absolutely terrible, or some line. So that's bad, not doing that. We have a box texture map, which actually doesn't look too bad. This looks pretty close to what happened automatically. But I think automatic still looks a lot better. We have spherical. It's kind of assuming, sphere is about the center and texture map is wrapped around that sphere. And cylindrical as well. You can also change the display mode to UV diagnostic to kind of see the direction that this texture map is being applied on all sides. So we see kind of that these lines are going up here, kind of getting cut off. Well, they're not getting cut off here, but these vectors are going kind of straight along the strap, but over here, we're going diagonal. So automatic actually does a really good job. It makes the texture look best. So we're going to stick with that. Turn on in-canvas render again. And this, like I said before, is going to be the best look for wrapping our texture. So that's a little bit of more refined texture mapping up here with the texture map controls. So I think we're almost done. This helmet is really coming to fruition. Let me show you really quickly how to add a decal. And then after that, we will complete our render. So let's go turn off in-canvas render. We're going to click on decal. And where's a nice decal on my computer? All sorts of stuff. So here's a nice decal, Fusion logo. And the cool thing about decals is that let's kind of orbit around here. You just click on the surface and it conforms to the geometry of that shape. So see how it's kind of wrapping itself around our helmet? And what's really cool, so you can adjust the opacity, so that's kind of nice. But what's really neat is that you can have chain faces turned on, and it will even wrap itself around the sides as well. You can kind of see that right here. So if you turn that off, it's just going to get cut off. So this is kind of more nice if you want the logo to be inside a specific, frame or a specific shape to be bound to corners. But if you do chain faces, this is also really nice if you are going over the edge. So I think this looks pretty good. I recommend kind of dragging around your texture or your decal with these selectors, these sliders over here. Scaling, vertical scaling, horizontal scaling. It's all pretty nice. So this looks good to me. Gonna kind of rotate it just a little bit. And if you click OK, have a pretty nice looking decal on the side of your helmet. So I mentioned earlier, how would you, what if you don't like the shine of, here, let me turn on in-canvas render first of all. This decal is kind of shiny. So what if you don't like the sheen or kind of the glimmer of the logo itself that you applied? Because the issue with decals is that they just have some sort of default shine to them. Right click on this, I should be able to edit it. Edit decal, perfect. You can't really change the shininess over here. So how I'd recommend doing this is putting a texture in this area over here. And then I would definitely conform that texture to a specific cutout region. And then you would give that texture custom properties, and the color of the texture would be this decal itself. And then if necessary, you could use the cutout feature to cut out even more of the texture. And of course, within those texture properties, you could edit the reflectance and the roughness to kind of get the shine that you're looking for, if the decal editor is not doing the job for you. So I think this looks pretty good. I'm going to click cancel, return to our home view, or our view one, not our home view. And let's do our final render. So to do your final render, click right up here in the render tab. And we have a lot of default settings for us, but Fusion was pretty smart and knew that we probably want something 16:9 because that's the aspect ratio we have defined right here. So that is exactly what we want to do. And I typically prefer more quality for renders. So let's do something that's just nice 720p. So 1280 by 720. Usually I prefer 1080p, but just for quickness, we'll do a nice 720p render because that's still high definition by the 16:9 standard. Exposure, keep that native. And also, you're going to want to be doing a cloud render. You can also do a local render on your computer, but things can get really hot. You try that. So forewarning, I've done renders before on one of my older laptops, and yeah, I may have burnt myself. The fan was not doing enough work. Yeah, I kept it. Do not put your laptop in your lap when you're working on these renders. So cloud render, takes a bit of that graphics card usage or whatever tools we're using to process these renders off our hands, and it does in the Amazon Web Servers. And also the nice thing about this is that you can continue working on whatever you want to while this is being beamed up to the cloud and while we're waiting for it to get sent back down. So as a student or an educator, you should have unlimited cloud credits. So make the most of those. Definitely make the render quality final. So let's click render. And we open up the rendering gallery down here, and we will see that this render is now in progress. All right, so we are going to click on our image here in the rendering gallery, and you can save it by downloading it as PNG or JPEG. Recommend PNG. And this render came out pretty good. So get rid of that, make that go away. Overall, I think this is a pretty good job. Could probably use with the decal, move closer to the back. The lighting looks pretty good. I'd probably try toying around with different lighting sources and environments to see what other reflections we could get, but I think this one looks pretty nice. This looks good here. Our light for the LED is not too blown out. I think that the yellow looks good. The texture itself, honestly, no one else is really going to notice it besides, you or, whenever you're working on these textures, no one else really cares much. But if you are not satisfied with the texture map, which I think this looks good but not perfect, you can always change it with those advanced texture map controls. And probably what I would do in this case is reapply this texture to all these individual faces, like we showed how to do before, and then make the texture kind of in line with each of these faces. So I would apply the texture to this face here, that nylon weave, just the face, not this entire body, and direct it to go straight down. And I think this one looks pretty good. The strap itself has a pretty nice weave pattern to it. So I'd probably do it piece by piece, this nylon, to make sure that the directions of the weave looks good. But yeah, overall, pretty satisfied with this. Thank you for watching this workshop. And feel free to email me if you have any questions that you'd like to answer right away. My email is spolak@calpoly.edu, calpoly.edu. And I'll be happy to answer your questions as you all are wrapping up these helmet models. But hopefully this was helpful. And I'll probably see you around for the workshop on Tuesday to answer any additional questions. Thank you.